must be. Yeah.
Okay.
Is it okay?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I start? Yeah, okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Yes, my name is Peter Bellwood, and I'm very grateful to the organisers of this conference for asking me to take part, and especially to give this keynote lecture to possibly 500 of you, many of you specialists in scientific fields that are way beyond my deep knowledge. My interest is in the general history of humanity. I am an archaeologist in background, but today I will talk about many topics, including linguistics and genetics, as well as archaeology. I should say from the start that the Neolithic for me is really a story about food production. That is the essence. Of course, we also have pottery and stone tools, but you cannot eat pottery or stone tools, and they are not, for me they're not a crucial aspect of the Neolithic. And many hunter-gatherers in the world, as we know, long before farming and since, have used both pottery and stone tools. Now, during my career, the last 40 years or so, I've written a number of books about essentially early agriculture and its impact upon the world. One of them over there is actually translated into Turkish. But I've written about farmers and islanders and migrants, and those are the topics that really interest me. And there's also a book that many of you might have seen, edited by me with Colin Renfrew, called Examining the Farming Language Dispersal Hypothesis. That is now 20 years old, but it is still widely read, I think. Okay. Now, in this keynote opening talk, I'm going to focus on the relationships between what I see as two slightly different fields. First of all, of course, we have origins. Now, crops and animals domesticated have origins, and many of you, I know, search for those origins. But once those origins have taken place, then there follow impacts, because human populations increase as farming becomes more and more developed. And then they begin to move across whole continents, taking with them their genes and their languages. And many of those movements can be traced. Today I'm going to focus on the western part of the old world, as we might call it, Europe and Asia. My colleague Xiaochun Hong will be giving the next keynote tomorrow, and she will look at Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia today. And I will also have quite a few things to say about precisely where we are now, because we're here in the northern part of the Fertile Crescent, which hundreds of archaeologists, maybe thousands, agree is one of the oldest, maybe the very oldest, location on Earth where agriculture actually began. And then if you think about what followed the agriculture, all of those civilizations, you will realize how important this area is. So origins research focuses upon sources and foundations of behavior and so forth. Behavioral skills. Humans exploit animals and plants for economic benefit, and in order to do so they have to domesticate them. Well, they can hunt them, but domestication produces far more rewards, of course. Impact research, of course, is all about the movement of those food production complexes. Impact research tracks the consequent human migrations that carry food production complexes with high degrees of transportability. Anything I think is important, I put in green. Domesticated plants, as I'm sure many of you realize, if they've lost their sensitivity, their dormancy and their day-length sensitivity, if you like, can be transported to other parts of the world. Animals can be transported all over the world, plants, to a lesser degree. And this is very important. The Polynesians carried their plants and animals in little boats, tens of 13,000 kilometers across the Pacific. That is what transportability means. So farmers can transport their crops and themselves and their genes and their languages into new and exotic environments, if they want to, and if they have a reason to do so, and very often they did. And of course they are spreading genes, the foundations of language families. And don't forget, these diasporas covered vast expanses long before any history. Now you will all know what is the Indo-European language family, all the way from, well, nowadays Iceland, I suppose, but I'm talking here pre-1492, before Columbus. The Indo-European language family was distributed from the British Isles to Bangladesh. And nothing in history tells you why. Alexander the Great had absolutely nothing to do with it. Neither did the Romans or anybody else. Neither did the Hittites, although they are important for other reasons. These expanses occurred many, many thousands of years ago. Now, my 60 years of research into archaeology, etc., have made me into, I guess, a student of human population history. That is a blended discipline. No university teaches it or ever will, I wouldn't think, but in order to practice it, you have to follow suggestions made by specialists in many fields, including genetics and linguistics. You don't have to do your own ancient DNA, but you do have to sort of talk to these people and see why they think the way they do when they make statements about human history. Now, in my view, the common ingredient for the expansion of agricultural societies and their major complexes of food production was demographic growth among settler populations. I don't think it was always climate change, it might have been now and again. Demographic growth is crucial. If populations are not growing, they will not move very far. They cannot be utterly stable or shrinking. They must be growing to have successful migration that lays down layers of new societies in places that are often thousands of kilometers away. I'm not a believer in cultural diffusion. Of course, in real life, people borrow from each other. I do not like elite dominance. I cannot find any real case in recent history where it's been significant. And if you all think about it, you will know very well that the world's major religions, like Islam and Christianity, are not all practiced by speakers of a single language. I won't go into details about that, but I think you all realise that the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, and no one there speaks Arabic. So, I mean, I think we have to think about these modern situations sometimes. Language shift, well, of course it occurs, often under oppressed populations, but vast populations of farmers are hardly going to change their language because a few people come riding in on horseback from somewhere and say, right, we're now in charge, you must all switch to our language. That has never happened in history, and many linguists have noted this and written books about it, including Nicholas Ostler wrote a very good book, Empires of the World, Empires of the World. But we know that the first farmers weren't great migrants. They didn't go very far because they were incipient. Now, we do know that in this part of the world there was a very important migration to the island of Cyprus by incipient farmers in the pre-pottery Neolithic age. That happened around 10,000 BC. Didn't go very far. It kind of stopped in Cyprus, and that was it for another 2,500 years. But during the pottery Neolithic, of course, people discovered how to milk their domestic animals. They adopted dairying technology, and of course they had their wheat and barley. The numbers increased, and off they went through the western part of Turkey, up through Istanbul, I guess, Marmara, into the Balkans, and the rest of it is history. And that's why many of you, including me, are probably alive today, deriving from the Neolithic population that spread across Europe. Not everybody. I'm perfectly willing to accept that there were major movements from what the classical era called the Pontic Steppes, north of the Black Sea, but I do not see that region as the source of all Indo-European languages. So the migrations of farmers took place quite a bit later than the beginnings of agriculture. The same in China, 2,000 or 3,000 years. Okay, so we're talking about, oh no, sorry, I'm going backwards here, pressing the wrong button. Yes, okay. So the very first farmers were not always great migrants, and successful migration required many skills and resources, including probably very highly domesticated species of plants and animals. Now, why did food production develop in the first place? I'm not going to answer that because many of you here will... Wait, how long do I have to talk? When must I stop? Because it's already quite late.
As long as you want.
As long as I want.
Yeah. You are Peter Bell.
Okay. Why did food production develop in the first place? Well, I don't actually know, and I'm not going to try and tell you, but I do know that things happened in the world that humans inhabited. Up here, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done that. Okay, going to that. Okay, 120,000 years ago, sorry, it's upside down up here, but the world was similar to now in terms of climate. In terms of oxygen isotope ratios, there was then a zigzagging downwards into the last ice age, 20,000 years ago. That was a horrible time by all accounts, and people did not develop farming then. I know there are sites like Ohalo in Israel that have wheat and barley remains, but they were, no one I think believes that they were totally farming in terms of economy. Then there was one of the remarkable dramatic shifts of climate out of the last ice age into the modern era. In here is also the Younger Dryas that is not shown. That was a short, sharp cold snap. But this rise from 20,000 years ago to current conditions was incredible. The sea level rose 120, 130 meters. That means that those great deltas of the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Yellow River didn't exist. They were all sea. And their river courses were incised. They were gorges full of water, ria, as I think geomorphologists call them, or fjords. Farming, but that sea level rise, of course, led to an immense change in the shape of the world. All of the coastal shelves that during the Ice Age were right out and falling off very steeply and very infertile in terms of marine production. They suddenly became flooded by warm, shallow sea, corals, kelp, major resources. This was all, of course, 12, 13,000 years ago, before agriculture started. But archaeologists like Lewis Binford and Kent Flannery noted this many years ago. This sea level rise was very important in human affairs. The first thing that happened after the last ice age was that people got to the Americas. That was not a farming migration. Hunters and gatherers, who I think generated the population demography needed, arose in Japan and recently neighboring regions like Sakhalin here and Kamchatka, and they migrated across Bering Strait to become the first Americans. Otherwise, the world, of course, improved greatly in productivity. So there was a rapid increase in terrestrial and inshore resources. One of the results of that was that in regions like this, in the Fertile Crescent, we had symptoms like the Natufian and Göbekli Tepe. The hunter-gatherers were getting busy, there were very many more of them. They were building things, and they were fiddling around with animals and plants, and probably starting to domesticate them. The domestication took quite a long time. There are two sides to domestication. The cultivation and the husbandry are the human activities, of course. The domestication is genetic change in the plants and animals, genetic change that makes them easier to process and harvest, and also far more productive in terms of the amount of food that they create. So why did farming start? Well, I'm not going to tell you. This is what this conference is all about. You can probably tell me. But, now, this is a recent map from Dorian Fuller and colleagues. Plants were domesticated in many parts of the world. And of course, many species of plants were domesticated by humans. Rather fewer animals. But you will notice that if you look at this huge list of plants, a few of them stand out. Oh, what have I done now? I pressed that, okay. A few of them stand out quite remarkably. The light has gone out, but...
Sorry, if you're hearing.
Yeah, sorry, can you get it back? Okay, the next one is what I want. Yeah, okay. Okay, that's the way to do it. Right, I don't know, the light has gone out, I think, but it doesn't matter. If you look up there, you will see the term Zea mays. If you look up at the top, you will see Triticum spp. Over here, you'll see Oryza sativa in China. That sort of thing tells you that some of these regions were far more important than others. Some of them produced incredible complexes of domesticated animals and plants. Jared Diamond has noticed this in many of his writings. And of course the Fertile Crescent produced probably the largest one, with all of those cattle, sheep and goats, and wheat and barley. China was a very close behind with millets, rice, pigs and dogs and so forth. Some areas were more important than others. And in my writings, I've always kind of focused on a few. On this map here, I've picked out Mesoamerica, the Central Andes, the adjacent southwestern regions of Amazonia, the Sahel and Sudan, the strip across sub-Saharan Africa, the Fertile Crescent, of course, East Asia, mostly within the modern borders of China. Interestingly, the New Guinea Highlands, that was definitely an area of agricultural development, independent of the rest of the world. We know that because in the New Guinea Highlands, there is a completely independent population. They are the speakers of Papuan languages. They are genetically related to Australian indigenous people, and they've been there for 50,000 years. Because they developed agriculture, the people who colonized Polynesia were never able to make a major impact on New Guinea. So that of course tells us that the New Guinea Highland people have had food production, quite large populations for a very long time. So I look at these homelands of agriculture, which I regard as having great importance in terms of expansion. And several of them, as I say here, went on to create some of the most incredible cultural civilizations, if you like, Bronze Age and so forth, literate civilizations of the world. Egypt, by the way, for me, is an extension, I suppose, of the Fertile Crescent. I don't see Egypt as a source of agriculture. It certainly had an incredible civilization, but that is a different matter. I regard the agriculture that fueled the settlement of the Nile Valley as coming from the Levant. I will not say a great deal about the Americas, but the Americas are incredible because these civilizations, Incas, Aztecs, Maya, Chavin, what have we got, Toltecs and Teotihuacan, Olmecs, they were independent of those in the Old World. I see no signs of close contact. This is humans behaving in similar ways because they are essentially humans. We're all one species and we all behave quite similarly wherever we come from in the world. Now, in the Americas there are regions of early agriculture that are extremely important, particularly, as I mentioned before, the Andes and Mesoamerica. But America was extremely interesting in that it was mostly plant-based food production. Animals were not of great significance. There were llamas and alpacas in the Andes, and there was no dairying, no use of milk. American cultures were essentially Neolithic all the way through, including the Maya, even the Incas. Of course, they knew how to work gold, silver, and copper, but they used those metals for ornaments and ritual activities. They didn't use them for tools or weapons. And the Americas never underwent an Iron Age. And of course, it was the Iron Age that was essentially behind those great empires that developed from the, let's say, the Neo-Assyrians onwards, through the Persians and the Hellenistic Greeks and the Romans and so forth. Iron drove that, but iron was never a factor in the Americas. But I do regard the Americas as forever amazing, simply because a lot of what they created was incredibly beautiful. They might have been rather bloodthirsty civilizations that had an unfortunate interest in human sacrifice, but they still created some quite remarkable constructions. Now, just briefly, if we compare the areas of the world where agriculture developed, we can classify them in terms of their. Okay, that's the second column on the left. Dear, oh dear. I've turned it off again, haven't I?
We are arranging.
Okay. The Fertile Crescent is a winter rainfall area. Most other areas of the world that had early agriculture are either monsoonal or summer rainfall. And that was quite important in world history. New Guinea, being equatorial, does not make marked seasons, but that is a little separate. But all of the American regions have summer rainfall, that is mostly in the tropical zone of the Americas. The Sahel and Sudan have summer rainfall. It's only really the Fertile Crescent that has a strong winter rainfall pattern, plus Europe and I guess adjacent regions. Well, there are a list there of the crops that are domesticated, the animals. Many regions, of course, did not produce domestic animals, none in New Guinea, none in southwestern Amazonia that are native there, as far as I know. Not really very many in Mesoamerica, although I have read ideas that possibly rabbits might have been domesticated and the turkey. And no native animals really in the Sahel and Sudan, and all of the sheep and goats, and probably the cattle too, came from Southwest Asia. Okay. And here I've tried to plot something about the overall history of agriculture. I've tended to differentiate between when agriculture is established, which in the Middle East, of course, is in the PPFB about 8,500 BC. In Africa, pottery predates agriculture in the Sahara, but then Fertile Crescent domesticated animals arrive. As far as I can see, agriculture in Egypt is quite recent. It's pottery Neolithic. If there was a pre-pottery Neolithic there, no one has ever really found it and made it significant, if you like. In East Asia, pottery is present before millet and rice, and so forth. The American civilizations tend to be a little younger than those in the old world. That may reflect, I suppose, the absence of major domestic animals. I don't really know, but agriculture in South America and Mesoamerica, well, agriculture was established. It starts, I suppose, before I say it's established, but when I say agriculture established, I'm thinking in terms of villages and ceremonial centres, rather than simply incipient agriculture. Another point about all of this, which often gets overlooked, is that the animals moved much further than the plants. This is an old map of mine on the left. It comes from my book, First Migrants, that I'm now rewriting and revising. I may well have to redraw this map. But the Fertile Crescent complex of crops essentially stayed in the Fertile Crescent and Europe. It moved into Egypt, of course, and down towards, upriver towards Sudan, and eventually it moved into northern India and Pakistan. The crops didn't move much further, however, and did not until recent times. During the Bronze Age, wheat and barley spread into China, but that was long after the beginnings of their domestication. The African monsoon crops, millets, remained in Africa, but they were taken around 2000 BC across the Indian Ocean to India, where they became part of the Harappan or Indus Valley food production complex. In East Asia, the millets and rice that drove those civilizations in China, Southeast Asia, essentially remained in that area, and they did not go into the Pacific except for rice in the Mariana Islands, which are north of New Guinea. But the pigs and dogs went everywhere. And of course, so did the cattle, sheep and goats from the Fertile Crescent. On the right, I've got a map by Ellen Jus from a monograph about the dates of domesticated animals in Africa. And it's about cattle, domestic cattle, through the Sahara. They're all in the range of 8,000 to 4,000 years ago. As you go south, they get into the range of 4,000 to 2,000 years ago. These movements took a long time, and they are well plotted by archaeologists. But I would say that, yes, the domestic animals, cattle and sheep especially, got right through Africa. But the crops certainly didn't. The same thing, yes, okay, the same thing happens in Southeast Asia. Yeah, okay. With agriculture, of course, populations grow, and I've just got two examples here. I'll take the first one from China. This is a couple of maps comparing at the top, the Yellow River, at the bottom, the Yangtze, the southern river is the Yangtze River. It's a little bit blurred, but these are counts of archaeological sites, not radiocarbon dates. But 8,000 years ago, when agriculture was becoming more important, incipient if you like, the numbers of sites are quite few. By 5,000 years ago, which is the Longshan, Liangzhu, Xujialing periods in China, the population, especially in the Yellow River, had increased incredibly, and some Chinese archaeologists suggest that between 8 and 5,000 years ago, the population of those great plains of northern China increased by a factor of possibly 30. Now this is incredible. China, of course, has a vast population today, and it probably did in the Neolithic. It may well have had populations that were very much larger than those in the Fertile Crescent simply because of its huge fertility. But don't forget that many of those riverine plains, the Yellow and the Yangtze, were not there early in the Holocene. They were under shallow sea. So the farmers had to wait for the sea to retreat to expose coastal lowlands that they could grow, especially their rice on. And here are some examples from the Fertile Crescent. Charts from people who I think are in the audience. Well, up on the top left, Neil Roberts et al. And Stephen Shannon, who's here and wrote a book recently about Neolithic Europe. This diagram shows, these are populations estimated from densities and numbers of radiocarbon dates. Southern Levant at the top, northern Levant in the middle, south-central Anatolia at the bottom. The southern Levant and the northern Levant and upper Mesopotamia, which is where we are now, shows some quite strong increase in radiocarbon date numbers, basically, after, what are we, about 11,000 BC, at about the time of Göbekli Tepe, or perhaps slightly before. The south-central Anatolia, which I guess is mostly the Konya Plain region, is somewhat later, but not that much later. And at the top, a couple of maps from Ivo Rosenstock, dating from 2019. Southwestern Turkey, a very important area for the Neolithic settlement of Europe, at 8,000 BC, not terribly many sites, but at the second one, 6,000 BC, when farmers started going into the Balkans and settling Europe, the number of sites in southwestern Anatolia is very much greater. Here is another chart at the bottom right from Parmisano et al., a paper, again based on radiocarbon numbers. You'll notice that they have a very interesting dip in the pottery Neolithic A, which is in here. And that is of great interest to me. Why did that dip occur? Is it because some disease turned up, a plague of some sort, or is it because many people decided that life was perhaps better somewhere else, and they left, and they went to Europe and into North Africa and up the Nile River and so forth, and became the ancestors of the Indo-Europeans and the Afro-Asiatic speaking populations of the world today. And as you will all know, these developments, of course, had huge repercussions. Here in the Fertile Crescent, here is an artist's representation from the Andrew Moore's monograph on Abu Huraira, what it might have looked like in the late PPMB about 7,500 BC. Quite dramatic. Many hectares of what we all know about Chateau Rouge and Ain Ghazal these sorts of sites were quite numerous at this time. So population is booming, and we know a lot about this. The colonial era is full of it, especially in places like Australia and North America. In 1840, women from mostly the British Isles who went to Australia averaged 6.8 children. And those children did not die. Australia was a very rich place for food. The first European settlers had difficulty before their sheep and European crops became numerous. They had to go and kill kangaroos. That was not a very popular activity with the Aboriginal population because they also relied on kangaroo meat. And of course, the European population increased dramatically, and in French Canada, and I think in the USA as well, very dramatically, being in an area where indigenous populations were quite low in density. But we do know, of course, that those indigenous populations in the colonial era suffered incredibly. They had no resistance to diseases from Europe and Asia, smallpox, measles. Thousands of them died. Their land was taken, the women were taken. Sheep farming and hunting and gathering do not coexist because hunters tend to want to kill the sheep, and the farmers often shoot the kangaroos. So this was a major disaster, and Australian politics and society today are full, of course, of discussion about this, how to repair it, can they repair it? It's a very difficult issue. And in North America, people colonized by farmers often do suffer immensely in social terms. Their languages disappear completely, and the world has an enormous record of this in the last 200 or 300 years. Now, the final topic I want to come to is this issue of languages and genes, of course. I'm not a linguist and I'm not a geneticist, but I know enough to be able to read the papers concerned and to think about what is being suggested in terms of history. So why would languages be of any importance? Well, what was their significance in terms of human population history? A language family is classified as such because it's a feature of common ancestry from what some people call a proto-language. The languages within a family share a cognate body of linguistic expression, vocabulary, that has a common origin, that has been inherited by generation to generation transmission within linguistic communities of native speakers, rather than acquired through borrowing. If it's all borrowing, then it's visible to linguists. And I've no doubt that the major language families, including the Australasian one that much of my study has been in, occurred long before the beginnings of historical records, and they spread with human migration. And as I said before, conquest and elite dominance alone do not spread, and never have spread languages very far, certainly not in historical times. And I see the early farmers as spreaders of the foundation layers of these language families. Major ones, I'll discuss them in more detail in a moment. The colonizing groups concerned may not have been huge in the first instance. Many of us might have read Julius Caesar and about the migration of the Helvetii from Switzerland into Gaul in 58 BC. He describes thousands of them climbing into wagons with their wives and families and heading for land in central Gaul. Unfortunately, Julius Caesar wasn't very happy and he drove them back. But he described the migration in enormous detail as a sort of mass migration. But I think most ancient migrations on a day-by-day basis were actually quite small. What happened was that the populations concerned, once they got to their new territories with their portmanteau biotas or complexes of plants and animals, could reproduce themselves with immense speed, doubling, trebling every generation, especially in areas where there were no major diseases or severe threats. So many of these migrations did not start as mass migrations from the start, but they built up from within. On this question of elite dominance, we're going to have a little battle here, Greece versus Rome, and I think this is quite important. Alexander the Great conquered a very large amount of territory in Asia. I'm sure you all know about this, but you might also know that many Greeks travelled with him. He founded Greek cities, usually called Alexandria, and then he died at a very young age. And he had successors who continued to rule in different areas for a couple of hundred years, but eventually the Greek language disappeared from the whole of that region, except of course in Western Asia, in Byzantine, Anatolia and Levant and Egypt. And there's no trace of it today, no trace whatsoever. Once you get beyond east of, I don't know, east of Iraq, east of the Levant, I suppose, yes, it has completely disappeared. The Romans, however, did spread a language family. 500 million people today still speak Latin. We don't think of it as Latin. It's Portuguese and Spanish and Italian and so forth. They spread that language because the Romans had this habit of settling their veterans in the provinces that they conquered. They gave them land and monetary rewards, and they were doing it for a very long time, and they had a very large army. So eventually, of course, Latin was adopted where it says Romance language in Spain and France and Italy and Romania. So that was a linguistic success. But even that, when you think about the whole of the Indo-European language family, from Germanic at the top west down to Indic in northern India, it's only a very tiny part of it. That had nothing to do with the origins of Indo-Europeans. That's a completely secondary process. Now, the old world, and I'm sorry that I do not have time to discuss the Americas, although they're equally interesting, has a large number of these incredibly huge language families that are spoken by billions of people in many cases. Afro-Asiatic, Indo-European. Trans-Eurasian is a rather difficult one. I won't go into detail, but it's sort of it includes Turkish and Japanese and Korean. But also Austronesian in the Pacific, Austroasiatic, and especially the Bantu subgroup of the Niger-Congo languages. And Dravidian as well in southern India. Those language families spread hugely in, well, most linguists would suggest within the past 10,000 years, within the time range of agriculture. They're not Paleolithic 25,000 years ago, that would not be widely accepted. And in my writings, I've often suggested that a number of these languages, particularly Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, Afro-Asiatic, the Bantu branch of Niger-Congo, the Kra-Dai or Thai languages, Austroasiatic, that's Khmer, Vietnamese and others, and Austronesian in the Pacific, plus several American ones, spread with early farming activities. So I would locate the homelands of language families as within these areas of early farming that I've included within Broken Lines, including New Guinea, which has its own major language family called Trans-New Guinea. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these because there isn't time, but I will talk just a little bit now. I want to talk about Indo-European because it is essential to this part of the world. It is my view that any explanation for a language family that is going to be acceptable, and don't forget we can't prove things in prehistory, we can only select the most likely hypotheses to explain the situations that we're interested in explaining. The history of a language family and a source and a history of expansion can only really be explained if we have three bodies of data. There should be, in theory, a coherent archaeological record of expansion of a food-producing complex with related cultural expressions, and also, of course, a radiating slope through time, with radiocarbon dates becoming younger as you go further away from the presumed source, presumed origin region, throughout the geographical range of the family. Then, of course, we need the expansion of a genetic ancestry, sufficient in intensity to suggest that settlement was the answer rather than simply the borrowing of language from neighbouring people. I mean, if the genetic record is very, very thin and faint, suggesting it's elite dominance or cultural diffusion, then I'm afraid I would not accept it as a viable hypothesis to associate with the spread of a language family. And there has to be a convincing linguistic argument. There has to be some sort of computational analysis of the languages, together with a convincing reconstruction of a proto-language and a convincing order of subgroup differentiation. We can never hear a proto-language, we never will, but there should be sufficient detail to allow ranking of potential language family homeland hypotheses. Now, on language families, many of you will realise, if you think about it deeply, that they are not complete. When a language family first spread, it would have laid down a layer of language. And that language would then have differentiated into subgroups over time. It takes about up to 1,000 years for languages to lose comprehensibility. We know this from historical records, like the Latins of the world. Polynesian languages, different island groups would still communicate even after 500 years of isolated separation. We know that from records of people from the 18th century when they were first discovered by Europeans. But languages can also destroy and replace each other. Now, if we think about Indo-European, we know through history that there were Anatolian and Tokharian and Celtic subgroups. Celtic is now hanging on the far northwestern fringes of Europe. They were widespread thousands of years ago. Other subgroups within Indo-European, especially the Romance languages, the Germanic languages and the Slavic languages, have wiped them out. And Greek, of course, wiped out the Anatolian languages. That means that the subgroups that formed at the base of the Indo-European family tree have been destroyed. And we know about them because Anatolian was written in cuneiform writing on clay tablets from Hattusa. And that is very important. The Tokharian language was written in the late centuries AD. They were Buddhists living in the Tarim Basin. But of course, linguists can read those documents. We know about them. We do not know about the extinct subgroups of language families that have no early writing. And that is that makes life very difficult. You can't argue from data that you don't have, but you can think about what the data you don't have can imply for what might have existed at one time. Indo-European, well, here is the latest take. I have to say that every computational analysis going back for 20, 30 years, they all say Hittite is the first separation. There's hardly any differentiation in that, no matter who produced the chart. Here's the most recent chart over here by Paul Hegarty et al. Came out in Science, I think, last year. They give, it is possible to calculate time depth, of course, through historical data. They give a time depth of, 8,000 years or so, 6,000 BC for the Indo-European language family, which is pretty much well within, the range of Neolithic colonization of Europe. And most of the subgroups, if you can read them over here on the right, were already well under differentiation by 6,000 years ago, including Indo-Iranian and Greek and everything else. This is long before the migrations from the steppes north of the Black Sea. I don't deny there were migrations from those steppes, but they didn't spread Indo-European languages into India or Anatolia or Iran or even very much around the Mediterranean. And of course, well, the other day I was in a museum in Istanbul. Here we are, a Hittite document. Very important. I can't read it, but this is why we know all about Anatolia and its importance and why it no longer exists. Well, there are three homeland regions, of course. One of them is the Neolithic, which I do follow, and I agree with my colleague Colin Renfrew from Cambridge, who wrote about this many years ago. I think Colin was right, quite frankly. And then the Pontic Steppes, homeland north of the Black Sea. Then, of course, there is a hybrid model that comes out sometimes, and this is from Paul Hegarty's paper. For some reason, Paul decides that the whole family comes from Armenia. I'm not quite sure why, I can't work that out. And he has a complex series of migrations going separately from Armenia through Turkey into southeastern Europe, then other ones through the Pontic Steppes into northern Europe. That is fine, but when I read that article very carefully, I realized that the main reason why he was pointing to Armenia was that geneticists a year before had published another paper suggesting that Caucasian populations were sort of the main ones in the spread of Indo-European languages into the Pontic Steppes and into Eastern Europe. And this map was published of the Caucasian hunter-gatherer DNA is in blue, the Anatolian Neolithic is in yellow, and the red one is indigenous hunter-gatherers. I'm not convinced here that we're seeing anything that's of great significance for Indo-European languages, and of course in the European case, the Anatolian DNA is very dominant. The Caucasian DNA is very minor. Indeed, the Anatolian DNA is pretty dominant everywhere except in the Pontic Steppes. And that is important to me. This is a paper that or a map that I published in my book, 5 Million Year Odyssey, suggesting this Fertile Crescent origin and movements to east and west, and of course south up the Nile Valley. This is nothing new. I mean, people have been making suggestions like this for many years. But the movement east across the Iranian plateau towards Mehrgar, on the Indus River, or near the Indus River, that also, I think, probably carried some Anatolian and Iranian DNA, of course, but once they reached Mehrgar, which has a pre-pottery Neolithic, the process of expansion stopped because the Indus River is a monsoonal area with summer rainfall, and they had to adapt their wheat and barley to a winter irrigation regime that seems to have taken them some time. In terms of the genetics of the European Neolithic, well, this is a classic chart by Wolfgang Haag et al. I think he's in the audience here somewhere, showing the arrival of Anatolian DNA at the bottom in the archaeological record right through Europe, especially southern Europe, much less so in northern Europe. And then from the late Neolithic onwards, Chalcolithic, late Neolithic, the arrival of this Yamnaya DNA from the Pontic Steppes. I have no disagreement with this, it's fine. And amongst modern populations, of course, many northern Europeans, including me, I suppose, since I come from the UK, probably carry a great deal of Pontic Steppes DNA. But a more recent chart on the right by Morton Allentoft et al., published this year, 10 years after the one on the left, shows, I think, more intricately that well, it's a little difficult to see, but the brown, which is the Anatolian Neolithic, is a very major replacement across the whole of Europe. Everything must have changed dramatically at that time with the Neolithic spread. The pink one, which is the middle Don DNA from the Pontic Steppes, is important in the Baltic and Eastern Europe, and in Northern Europe. It becomes far less important at the top in Southeastern Europe. And the yellow one, which is Caucasus, is very small, very minor significance right through the prehistoric sequence. I should mention also that Anatolian DNA does turn up in Central Asia, in Neolithic cultures and Bronze Age ones in Turkmenistan, especially in the Oxus civilization or the Bactria-Margiana cultural complex, which I suspect may have been the source of the Tokharians. That is the red in this map here. Now, archaeologically, I've also looked at this very carefully. Yes, the corded ware on the right and the bell beakers on the left, they do certainly show a lot of Pontic Steppes inspiration. I don't doubt that at all. We have up there the Yamnaya and its colleagues in the Pontic Steppes north of the Black Sea, spreading into the corded ware cultures of early Bronze Age Europe, and the bell beaker cultures of Western Europe and the British Isles, early Bronze Age. But you will note that neither of those cultural complexes ever had much of a presence in Southeastern Europe or in Anatolia or in India or Iran. And if you go east of the Caspian Sea into the homeland of the Andronovo culture, which is often said to be the source of the Indo-European languages of northern India, you'll find that there's no trace of the Andronovo culture at all in northern South Asia. Absolutely none. They didn't go there. And that is really all there is to it. Well, I won't discuss chariots and horses, but I would say that my view now of the archaeology and linguistic history of South Asia suggests to me that the Neolithic spread slowed down as it entered the monsoonal zone, slowed down by perhaps 2,000 years, entering the Indus Valley from the Zagros and from the Fertile Crescent, not arriving in southern India until about 4,000 years ago, carrying Dravidian languages, which must have originated to the northwest in what is now Pakistan and possibly east of Iran. Some linguists, of course, suggest that the Dravidian languages were related to Elamite of western Iran. But my suspicion is that this wonderful civilization called the Harappan is the direct ancestor of the modern Hindu and Buddhist and Indic-speaking cultures and languages of northern India. For those of you who haven't been there, the monument at the top is a Buddhist stupa, but the rest of it, that is 1st century AD or something like that. But this incredible brick-using civilization with a corbelled drain from the tank, and corbelled arches are still, of course, classic in all Hindu temples through history, and Buddhist ones as well. But I suspect that this was the source of the cultures of northern India. Now, that, and also one final point is that with the eventual decline of the Harappan in the Indus Valley itself, we can see at the top the distribution at 2500 BC. This map is from articles by Cameron Petrie, published recently. That is the mature Harappan distribution at the top. The Indus Valley itself, sites are numerous and widespread. With the post-Harappan, about 1900 BC, the Indus Valley is very widely abandoned for reasons that are not particularly clear, but everybody seems to move up into the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in the vicinity of Delhi. And from there, they go down the Ganges River to Bangladesh eventually, and the delta of the Ganges. So I suspect that this is perhaps the main route for Indo-European languages into South Asia. Of course, Alexander the Great brought in artistic traditions into northern Pakistan. But I cannot see that this spread with any visible archaeological population from the Pontic steppes. There is just no evidence that would agree with that. So we come to a final conclusion about this. I'll just go down to the bottom. Well, let's just go to number 4. It is my belief that the Fertile Crescent source for the Indo-European language family fits all fields the best. It's not perfect. There's very little DNA from India, for instance. And a Levant source for Afro-Asiatic languages fits better than the source in Northeast Africa for that group of languages. So that makes this part of the world very important. And in the last, this year, a rather interesting linguistic paper was published using a new system of analysis by Chinese archaeologists. This was in Nature Communications. They used principal components methods rather than phylogenetic methods. But they locate the sources of these 4 major language families, Sino-Tibetan in the Yellow River, which is widely accepted, Indo-European in the northern Fertile Crescent. Their idea is that they can plot the movements of languages from homeland areas. Bantu in the Cameroon, Nigeria region, and the Arawakan languages of South America in southwestern Amazonia. What to conclude? I regard the Neolithic as the most important period in human. Absolutely immense. And no socio-political unit in history, any empire you like, Iberian, British, Alexander the Great, had anything to do with it. They came anywhere near it in significance. Well, I guess the British one might if you include the North America and Australia, but we won't get into all of that detail now. Okay. So it's highly appropriate for me that we should be meeting within one of the most important regions in the world to undergo what we might call a neolithization shift. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bellwood, for your speech, for your lecture.